The spring wind carried the scent of fresh earth and possibility across the Montana territory, but it couldn't reach the shadows that clung to the Garrett homestead like a persistent winter frost. Luke Garrett stood in the doorway of the barn, his large frame silhouetted against the morning light, watching his father Silas count the coins from their meager egg sales with the intensity of a man tallying his soul's worth. At 22, Luke possessed the gentle heart of a child wrapped in the body of a man who'd known too much disappointment, his pale blue eyes holding an innocence that his father had long since dismissed as worthlessness. "Boy, you get them chickens fed proper this time," Silas called without looking up from his counting, his voice carrying the edge that Luke had learned to fear more than winter storms. "Last batch of eggs was small as pebbles. You keep feeding them wrong and we'll have nothing but bones and feathers come market day." Luke nodded eagerly, his thick fingers already reaching for the feed bucket. "Yes, Papa. I'll feed him good. Real good." His words came slowly, carefully shaped by a mind that worked differently than most, but his earnestness was unmistakable. He'd been feeding those chickens for 3 years now, ever since his mother passed, and knew each bird by the sounds they made and the way they tilted their heads when he approached. Silas finally looked up, his weathered face creased with perpetual dissatisfaction. "And don't go wandering off like yesterday. Mrs. Patterson at the Mercantile was asking questions about why you looked so poorly fed. Told her you'd been sick, but she got them sharp eyes that see too much." He stepped closer to Luke, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You remember what happens when you make me look bad in town, don't you, boy?" The color drained from Luke's face as his hand instinctively moved to his left arm, where yesterday's bruises lay hidden beneath his worn flannel shirt. "I remember, Papa. I won't make you look bad. I promise. See that you don't." Silas pocketed the coins and headed toward the house, leaving Luke alone with the chickens and the weight of another day's careful navigation around his father's unpredictable temper. 3 miles down the winding dirt road that connected the scattered homesteads of Cedar Valley, Sarah Miles was discovering that being a widow on the frontier required skills no finishing school had ever taught. She stood in her small kitchen, flour dusting her dark hair as she attempted to master the art of sourdough bread, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the window. A man she didn't recognize was riding up her lane, leading a pack horse laden with supplies. "Morning, ma'am," the stranger called, touching the brim of his hat as he dismounted. "Name's Tom Bradley. I'm the new circuit minister for this territory. Heard tell there's a widow woman here might need some help with heavy chores." Sarah stepped onto her porch, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "I'm Sarah Miles." "That's thoughtful of you, Reverend Bradley, but I'm managing well enough." Her voice carried the careful strength of a woman who'd learned to stand on her own after losing her husband to a logging accident the previous autumn. "I'm sure you are, Mrs. Miles, but the Lord calls us to bear one another's burdens." He gestured toward her roof, where several shingles had come loose during the last storm. "Looks like you could use some repairs up there. Won't take but a few hours." As Reverend Bradley worked on her roof that morning, their conversation naturally turned to the neighbors scattered throughout the valley. "Been visiting all the homesteads," he said during a break, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah. "Interesting folks out here. Met the Garrett family yesterday, father and son working a place about 3 miles north of you." Sarah nodded. "Silas and Luke. I've seen them at church services when weather permits. Poor Luke seems to struggle with understanding things, but he's always been polite when I've spoken to him." Reverend Bradley's expression grew thoughtful. Noticed the boy seemed mighty thin for someone doing farm work, and nervous as a cat around his father. "Sometimes a man of God sees things that need seeing, if you take my meaning." Before Sarah could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Henderson, a neighboring woman whose sharp wit and sharper tongue made her both an invaluable friend and a formidable enemy. "Well, if it ain't our new preacher man," Martha called out as she approached on her sturdy mare. "Hope you're not filling Sarah's head with ideas about needing a man to fix every little thing." "Just lending a hand where it's needed," Reverend Bradley replied with a good-natured smile. "Though I suspect Mrs. Miles could handle most anything this frontier throws at her." Martha dismounted and joined them on the porch, her keen eyes taking in the minister's work. "Speaking of handling things, Sarah, you heard anything strange about the Garrett place lately?" "My youngest saw Luke in town 2 weeks ago, said the boy looked like he hadn't had a proper meal in a month." "Now, Martha," Sarah said carefully, though her brow furrowed with concern, "we shouldn't spread gossip about neighbors." "Ain't gossip when it's concern for a simple soul who can't speak for himself," Martha replied firmly. "That boy's got the mind of a child in a man's body, and his father's got a temper that's been getting worse since his wife passed. Some of us have been wondering if Luke's getting proper care." Reverend Bradley set down his coffee cup, his expression serious. "In my experience, the Lord often places us exactly where we need to be to serve His purposes. Perhaps it's no coincidence that I've been assigned to minister in this valley at this particular time." Over the following weeks, as spring deepened into early summer, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the Garrett homestead during her occasional trips past their property. She began to notice things that troubled her. Luke working alone in the fields while his father remained in the house until well past sunrise, the young man's clothes growing increasingly ragged, and most disturbing of all, the way Luke seemed to shrink into himself whenever Silas appeared. The first direct encounter came on a warm May morning when Sarah discovered Luke sitting by the creek that bordered both their properties, his shoulders shaking with silent tears. She approached slowly the way she would a wounded animal. "Luke, are you hurt?" He looked up at her with those pale blue eyes, now red-rimmed and frightened. "Mrs. Miles? I didn't mean to be on your land. Papa says I ain't supposed to bother neighbors." "You're not bothering anyone, Luke. This creek belongs to God, not to me." She settled herself on a fallen log nearby, maintaining enough distance to avoid frightening him further. "What's troubling you, son?" For a long moment, Luke said nothing, picking at a loose thread on his shirt sleeve. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush. "Papa says I'm worthless. Says I can't do nothing right. Says Mama died, 'cause she was ashamed of having a stupid son like me." Sarah's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. "Oh, Luke, that's not true. Not any of it. Your mama loved you dearly, I saw it every Sunday at church. And you're not worthless. You're kind and gentle, and that's worth more than all the book learning in the world. Papa don't think so. He gets real mad when I make mistakes. Says I'm too stupid to learn proper." Luke's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes he hits me real hard when I do things wrong. But I try, Mrs. Miles. I try so hard to be good." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd suspected something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed by Luke himself made her stomach churn with anger and protective instinct. "Luke, listen to me. A father shouldn't hit his son for making mistakes. That's not how love works. But Papa says it's 'cause he loves me. Says he's trying to teach me to be better." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, recognizing the twisted logic that abusers use to justify their cruelty. "Luke, real love is patient and kind. It doesn't hurt on purpose. You don't deserve to be hit, no matter what mistakes you make." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of running water providing a peaceful backdrop to Sarah's racing thoughts. She was beginning to understand that Luke's situation was far worse than anyone in the community had realized, and she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Luke, I want you to know something," she said finally. If you ever need help or if you're scared, you can come to me. Day or night. You understand?" He nodded slowly, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in the wind. "You really mean that, Mrs. Miles?" "I really mean that. And Luke, what we talked about today, maybe it's best if you don't mention it to your father. Some conversations are private between friends." "We're friends?" The wonder in his voice made Sarah's eyes well with tears. "Yes, Luke. We're friends." As summer progressed, Sarah found herself creating reasons to visit the general store when she knew the Garretts would be in town, observing the interaction between father and son with growing alarm. Silas treated Luke with a public civility that fooled casual observers, but Sarah was learning to read the subtle signs. The way Luke's shoulders tensed when his father approached, the careful way he held his left arm, the haunted look that would flash across his face when Silas spoke sharply. The breaking point came on a scorching July afternoon when Sarah was returning from Martha Henderson's place and heard shouting coming from the Garrett property. She pulled her wagon to a stop and listened, her blood running cold as Silas's voice carried across the distance. "You worthless piece of nothing. Can't even water the horses without spilling half of it. Your mother should have drowned you the day you were born." Sarah climbed down from her wagon and crept closer to the fence line, staying hidden behind a stand of cottonwood trees. What she saw made her hands clench into fists. Silas had Luke backed against the barn wall, his face red with rage as he berated the young man. Luke stood perfectly still, taking the verbal assault with the resigned acceptance of someone who'd learned that resistance only made things worse. "I'm sorry, Papa," Luke whispered. "I'll be more careful. I promise." "Your promises ain't worth the air you waste making them," Silas snarled. Without warning, he backhanded Luke across the face with enough force to send the young man stumbling. "Maybe a few days with nothing but water will teach you to be more careful with what we got." Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out as Luke pressed his hand to his cheek, blood trickling from his split lip. She watched in horror as Silas stormed toward the house, leaving Luke standing alone by the barn, touching his face with trembling fingers. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of her, wrestling with the knowledge of what she'd witnessed. In the morning, she would need to make some difficult decisions about how to help Luke without making his situation worse. But tonight, she could only sit in the lamplight and pray for wisdom, her heart heavy with the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, a gentle soul was suffering in silence. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's door. Luke stood on her porch in the early dawn light, his face bearing fresh bruises and his clothes torn at the sleeve. He clutched a small bundle wrapped in a dirty cloth, and his eyes held a desperation that made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. "Mrs. Miles?" His voice was barely above a whisper. You said if I ever needed help?" Sarah opened her door wider without hesitation. "Come in, Luke. Come in right now." As he stepped into her kitchen, Sarah got her first clear look at the extent of his injuries. Besides the facial bruises, she could see finger-shaped marks on his upper arms and what looked like rope burns around his wrists. Her stomach lurched with rage and protective fury. "Luke, what happened to you? Papa got real mad last night. Said I lost some chickens but I didn't. I counted real careful. But he said I was lying and he..." Luke's voice broke. "He tied me in the root cellar all night. Said maybe some time in the dark would teach me to tell the truth." Sarah's hands shook as she guided Luke to a chair and began preparing warm water and clean cloths to tend his wounds. "Luke, this has to stop. What your father is doing to you, it's not right and it's not your fault. But where can I go?" The question came out as a broken whisper. "Papa says nobody else would want a stupid boy like me. Says I'm too dumb to take care of myself. Sarah knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. Luke, listen to me. You're not stupid. You're different, yes, but different doesn't mean worthless. And there are people who would care for you properly, people who understand that love means protection, not punishment. As she cleaned his wounds and bandaged his wrists, Sarah found herself making a decision that would change both their lives forever. She couldn't send Luke back to face more abuse, but she also couldn't simply hide him away. The community would need to be involved, and that meant trusting that the good people of Cedar Valley would rally around someone in need. Luke, I'm going to ask you to be very brave. We're going to talk to some people who can help us make sure you're safe. Reverend Bradley and Martha Henderson and maybe some others. It might be scary, but you won't have to face it alone. Luke's eyes widened with fear and hope in equal measure. What about Papa? He'll be real angry when he finds out I told on him. Your Papa won't be able to hurt you anymore, Sarah said with quiet conviction. I promise you that. And Luke, from now on you're not alone. Do you understand? You're not alone anymore. As the sun rose higher over the Montana Territory, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Sarah Miles began planning what would become the most important battle of her life, not just for Luke's safety, but for his right to live with dignity and love in a community that would learn to protect its most vulnerable members. The easy part was over. The hard part was just beginning. The summer heat shimmered across the valley floor like liquid silver as Sarah Miles prepared for what she knew would be the most difficult conversation of her life. 3 days had passed since Luke had appeared on her doorstep, bearing wounds that spoke of systematic cruelty hidden behind closed doors. She'd kept him safe in her spare room, watching him slowly begin to believe that kindness could exist without punishment attached. But she knew they couldn't remain in hiding forever. Silas would come looking, and when he did, Sarah needed the community behind her. Reverend Bradley arrived first, his weathered face grave as he tied his horse to Sarah's hitching post. Behind him came Martha Henderson, her usual sharp tongue tempered by the seriousness of the situation, and Doc Morrison, whose medical bag suggested he'd already been briefed on the nature of the emergency. The last to arrive was Judge Harold Winters, a man whose reputation for fairness had earned him respect throughout the territory, even among those who disagreed with his rulings. "Where's the boy?" Doc Morrison asked without preamble, setting his bag on Sarah's kitchen table. "Resting in the back room. He's been sleeping poorly, nightmares mostly. Keeps apologizing for things that ain't his fault." Sarah's voice carried the exhaustion of 3 days spent watching a grown man flinch at every sudden sound. Reverend Bradley removed his hat and set it carefully on the sideboard. "Mrs. Miles, before we proceed, I need to ask you something directly. Are you prepared for what this might cost you? Silas Garrett isn't a man who takes kindly to interference, and he's got legal rights as Luke's father that won't be easy to challenge." "I've been thinking about that," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But some things are more important than easy. That boy's been suffering for years while we all looked the other way because it was convenient to believe Silas's lies about Luke being difficult or sickly. Well, I've seen the truth now and I can't unsee it." Martha Henderson leaned forward in her chair, her keen eyes studying Sarah's face. "You're talking about taking on one of the most established families in this valley. Silas has been here since before the territory was even properly surveyed. People know him, trust him. They're going to want proof, not just suspicions." "I've got proof," Sarah said quietly. She moved to the kitchen counter and retrieved a folded piece of paper, placing it in the center of the table. "Luke wrote this yesterday. Took him near 3 hours, but he wanted to tell his story in his own words." Judge Winters unfolded the paper carefully, his eyes scanning the laboriously formed letters that spelled out years of hidden torment. The handwriting was childlike but determined, each word a testament to Luke's struggle to communicate truths he'd been forced to keep secret for far too long. "Papa says I am bad when I spill things," the judge read aloud, his voice growing softer with each line. "He hits me with the leather strap when I forget to close the chicken coop. Says it is to make me remember better. But I try to remember. I try real hard. Sometimes he ties me in the cellar when I make him angry. It is dark and cold and I get scared, but Papa says scared is good for stupid boys like me. Mama used to say I was special, but Papa says Mama was wrong, and that is why God took her away, because she was too soft on me." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Martha Henderson's sharp intake of breath. Doc Morrison reached for the paper and continued reading, his medical training allowing him to see patterns of abuse that others might miss. "There's more," Sarah said softly. "About being denied food for days at a time when he makes mistakes. About being forced to sleep in the barn during winter storms. About Silas telling people in town that Luke's thinness and injuries come from clumsiness and sickness." Reverend Bradley stood and walked to the window, his shoulders tense with controlled anger. "The Lord calls us to protect the innocent and defend the vulnerable. I've been praying about this situation since our conversation last week, and I believe we're being called to act. Acting and succeeding are two different things," Judge Winters said pragmatically. "Silas will claim we're interfering with his parental rights. He'll say Luke's condition makes him an unreliable witness. He might even argue that firm discipline is necessary for someone with Luke's limitations. Then we make sure we have more than just Luke's word," Martha said firmly. "Sarah, you said you witnessed the abuse yourself?" Sarah nodded. 3 days ago. Saw Silas strike Luke hard enough to split his lip and draw blood. Heard him threaten to withhold food as punishment. And I've been documenting other things I've noticed: the rope burns on Luke's wrists, the way he flinches when anyone raises their voice, the fact that he automatically apologizes for things that aren't his fault." Doc Morrison looked up from Luke's letter. "With your permission, Sarah, I'd like to examine the boy. Document his injuries properly, get them on the medical record. If this goes to any kind of legal proceeding, we'll need that evidence." "Of course. But Doc, you need to understand, Luke's been conditioned to see medical attention as something he doesn't deserve. His father convinced him that only normal people get proper care when they're hurt." The doctor's jaw tightened. "I've been practicing medicine for 23 years, and I've seen my share of cruelty. But using a person's disability to justify abuse, that's a special kind of evil." A soft knock at the back door interrupted their conversation. Sarah rose to answer it, returning moments later with Luke beside her. He'd cleaned up as best he could, but the bruises on his face were still visible, and he moved with the careful gait of someone whose body carried too many hidden injuries. "Luke," Sarah said gently, "these are the people I told you about. They're here because they want to help you." Luke's eyes darted nervously around the room, taking in the assembled faces with the wariness of someone who'd learned that adult attention usually meant trouble. "Did I do something wrong, Mrs. Miles? I tried to be quiet like you said." "You didn't do anything wrong," Reverend Bradley said, his voice taking on the gentle cadence he used with frightened children. "We're here because we care about you, Luke. We want to make sure you're safe and treated with the kindness you deserve." "Papa always says I don't deserve much," Luke replied matter-of-factly, as if reporting the weather. "Says I should be grateful for what I get, 'cause most folks wouldn't put up with someone like me." The adults exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Judge Winters leaned forward slightly. "Luke, what do you think you deserve? If you could have anything you wanted, what would it be?" Luke considered this question with the seriousness of someone unaccustomed to having his opinions sought. "I guess I'd like to not be scared all the time. And maybe have enough food so my stomach don't hurt. And He paused, looking at Sarah with something approaching hope. Maybe have somebody who don't think I'm stupid, who might like having me around sometimes. You've got that already, Martha Henderson said gruffly, surprising everyone with the emotion in her voice. Sarah here's been worried sick about you for days. And the rest of us, we're starting to see that maybe we haven't been paying attention to things we should have noticed long ago. Doc Morrison approached Luke slowly, medical bag in hand. Son, I'd like to take a look at those injuries if you'll let me. Make sure nothing needs immediate attention. Luke instinctively stepped closer to Sarah. Is it going to hurt? Papa always says doctors just make things worse for people like me. I promise it won't hurt, Doc Morrison said solemnly. And Luke? People like you deserve the same medical care as anyone else. Actually, you deserve better care because you've been hurt when you should have been protected. As Doc Morrison began his examination, documenting each injury with clinical precision, the others continued planning their strategy. Judge Winters explained the legal complexities they faced. Territorial law was still evolving when it came to protecting vulnerable adults from family abuse, and Silas's paternal rights would be difficult to challenge without overwhelming evidence. We need witnesses, the judge said. People who've seen Silas's treatment of Luke over time. And we need to be prepared for him to fight back. He's going to claim that Luke's disability makes him incompetent to make decisions about his own welfare. What about competency? Reverend Bradley asked. Luke's clearly capable of understanding right from wrong, of communicating his needs. Shouldn't that count for something? In a perfect world, yes. But we're dealing with frontier justice and territorial law. The burden of proof will be on us to show that Luke can function independently, or at least that he'd be better off in someone else's care. Sarah felt a chill of fear. You're talking about taking Luke away from me too. What if the court decides he needs to be in some kind of institution? That's why we need to present a complete alternative, Judge Winters explained. Not just rescue Luke from a bad situation, but provide him with a stable, supportive environment where he can thrive. Are you prepared to take on that responsibility permanently, Sarah? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah looked at Luke, who was patiently allowing Doc Morrison to examine the rope burns on his wrists, answering the doctor's gentle questions with increasing confidence. In 3 days, she'd watched this broken young man begin to heal simply by being treated with basic human decency. The thought of him being sent away to some distant institution made her stomach clench with protective fury. Yes, she said firmly. I'm prepared to take on that responsibility. Luke's not a burden, he's a blessing that's been disguised as a problem by someone too cruel to see his worth. Doc Morrison finished his examination and returned to the group, his expression grim. Gentlemen, ladies, what we're dealing with here goes far beyond simple harsh discipline. Luke's injuries tell a story of systematic abuse spanning years. I've documented evidence of malnutrition, repeated beatings, restraint injuries, and what appears to be deliberate medical neglect. In my professional opinion, leaving this young man in Silas Garrett's care would be tantamount to signing his death warrant. The stark medical assessment galvanized the group into action. They spent the next hour developing a comprehensive plan that would address both Luke's immediate safety and his long-term welfare. Reverend Bradley would discreetly speak with other community members who might have witnessed Silas's treatment of his son. Martha Henderson would coordinate with the other women in the valley to gather testimony and provide support. Judge Winters would research legal precedents for protecting disabled adults from family abuse. As the meeting broke up, each person carrying their assigned responsibilities, Sarah found herself alone with Luke in her kitchen. He sat at her table, carefully eating a bowl of stew she'd prepared, his movements still cautious but no longer fearful. Luke, she said, settling into the chair across from him, Do you understand what's happening? What we're trying to do?" He set down his spoon and met her eyes directly, something he'd been unable to do when he first arrived. "You're trying to make it so Papa can't hurt me anymore. And maybe so I can stay here with you? That's exactly what we're trying to do. But I need you to understand that it might get difficult. Your father might say things about you, about me, about all of us. He might try to make you feel guilty or scared. Can you be strong enough to remember that what he says isn't true?" Luke nodded slowly. "Mrs. Miles? When I was little, before Mama got sick, she used to read me stories about brave people who fought dragons and bad men. She said the brave people were always scared, but they fought anyway because they had something worth protecting." He paused, his face serious with concentration. "I think maybe I got something worth protecting now too." "What's that, Luke?" "This feeling I get when I wake up here. Like maybe I ain't worthless after all. Like maybe there's people who might care if something bad happened to me." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I want to protect that feeling, Mrs. Miles. I want to be brave like them people in Mama's stories." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, marveling at how much healing had occurred in just 3 days of safety and kindness. "Then we'll be brave together, Luke. And we'll protect what we've found here." That evening, as Sarah prepared for bed, she stood at her bedroom window looking out across the valley toward the Garrett homestead. Somewhere in that house, Silas was probably raging about his missing son, perhaps even now planning his retaliation against anyone he suspected of interference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and harder choices. But tonight, she had the satisfaction of knowing that Luke was sleeping peacefully in the next room, free from fear for the first time in years. The sound of approaching hoofbeats in the darkness made her blood run cold. Through her window she could see a rider approaching at a gallop, and even in the moonlight she recognized Silas Garrett's distinctive silhouette. Her worst fears were about to be realized. The confrontation she'd been dreading was coming whether she was ready or not. Sarah quickly donned her robe and moved to the front of the house, checking that the door was securely barred. Behind her, she heard Luke stirring in his room, probably awakened by the sound of his father's arrival. "Sarah Miles." Silas's voice carried across the yard like a crack of thunder. "I know you got my boy in there. You got no right to interfere between a man and his son." Sarah took a deep breath and opened the front window just wide enough to speak through it. "Mr. Garrett, it's past midnight. If you have business with me, you can come back at a decent hour. Don't you play games with me, woman. Luke belongs with me and I aim to take him home where he belongs. You send him out here right now or I'll come in and get him myself." "You'll do no such thing," Sarah replied with more courage than she felt. "Luke is here of his own free will, and he's staying until proper arrangements can be made for his welfare." Silas's laugh was harsh and bitter. "His welfare? Lady, you don't know the first thing about dealing with a simpleton like Luke. He needs firm handling, or he'll never learn to function in the real world. I've been teaching him responsibility and discipline for years." "What you've been teaching him is fear and shame," Sarah shot back, her protective instincts overriding her caution. "I've seen what your discipline looks like, Silas Garrett, and it's nothing but cruelty dressed up as fatherly concern." The silence that followed was more threatening than any shouted words. When Silas spoke again, his voice carried a cold menace that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You're making a big mistake, Mrs. Miles. Bigger than you know. Luke's my son, my responsibility, my property under the law. And folks around here know better than to interfere with a man's handling of his own family. You keep him much longer and people are going to start asking questions about your motives. Might start wondering if a lonely widow's got improper designs on a simple-minded boy." The threat hit Sarah like a physical blow. In frontier communities, a woman's reputation was fragile as spun glass, and even unfounded rumors could destroy her standing permanently. Silas was betting that fear of social ostracism would force her to surrender Luke, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that this was only the beginning of the psychological warfare he was prepared to wage. "Luke's welfare is my only concern," she said steadily, though her heart was pounding. "And I'm not alone in that concern. There are others in this community who've seen what's been happening and are prepared to speak up for him." "Others?" Silas's voice sharpened with interest. "Who exactly you been talking to, Mrs. Miles? Because I think folks might be interested to know how you've been spreading lies about me and mine." Sarah realized she'd revealed too much, but it was too late to take back the words. "Good night, Mr. Garrett. As I said, if you have legitimate business, you can return at a proper hour." She closed the window and stepped back, her legs shaking with reaction. Behind her, she heard Luke's bedroom door open quietly. "Mrs. Miles?" His voice was small and frightened. "Is Papa real angry?" Sarah turned to find Luke standing in the hallway, his face pale in the lamplight. "He's upset, but he can't hurt you anymore, Luke. I promise you that." He sounded awful mad. Maybe I should go back with him. I don't want him to hurt you because of me." Sarah crossed the room quickly and took Luke's hands in hers. "Listen to me very carefully. You are not responsible for your father's choices or his anger. You don't deserve to be hurt, no matter what he's told you. And I'm not going to let him take you back to that house. Do you understand me?" Luke nodded, but she could see the fear still clouding his eyes. Years of conditioning weren't erased in a few days, and Silas's arrival had triggered all the old patterns of guilt and self-blame that had kept Luke trapped for so long. "We're going to get through this," Sarah said firmly. "Together. And when it's over, you're going to have the life you deserve, one filled with kindness and respect and all the things your mother wanted for you." As they stood together in the lamplight, listening to the sound of Silas's horse disappearing into the night, Sarah knew that the real battle was just beginning. But she also knew, with a certainty that surprised her with its strength, that she would fight that battle with everything she had. Luke had found his courage to protect the new life they were building together, and Sarah had found hers too. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as it swept across Cedar Valley, bringing with it the first real chill of approaching winter. 6 weeks had passed since Silas Garrett's midnight confrontation at Sarah Miles's homestead, and the battle lines had been drawn with the precision of a military campaign. What had begun as one woman's desperate attempt to protect a vulnerable young man had transformed into a community-wide reckoning with years of willful blindness and convenient ignorance. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching Luke work in her vegetable garden with the methodical care that characterized everything he did. Under proper nutrition and freedom from fear, he'd gained weight and strength, his movements no longer marked by the painful caution of someone expecting punishment at any moment. More importantly, he'd begun to speak his mind, offering opinions and asking questions with growing confidence. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, and it served as living proof of what proper care and respect could accomplish. The sound of approaching wagons drew her attention to the road, where a small convoy was making its way toward her homestead. Judge Winters led the procession, followed by Reverend Bradley, Doc Morrison, and Martha Henderson. Behind them came 3 more wagons carrying families from throughout the valley, the Andersons, the Pattersons, and the Crawfords, all of whom had agreed to testify about their observations of Luke's treatment over the years. Today was the day they'd all been preparing for, the formal hearing that would determine Luke's future. Judge Winters had managed to arrange for a territorial magistrate to preside over the proceedings, lending official weight to what could have remained a local dispute. The hearing would take place in the schoolhouse, the only building in Cedar Valley large enough to accommodate all the interested parties. "Luke," Sarah called through the open window, It's time to get ready. He looked up from the turnips he'd been carefully harvesting, soil still clinging to his hands and a look of nervous determination on his face. Over the past weeks, Sarah and Reverend Bradley had worked with him extensively, helping him prepare to tell his story in his own words. It wouldn't be easy. Silas would undoubtedly attempt to discredit his son's testimony by emphasizing his intellectual limitations, but Luke had proven surprisingly articulate when speaking about subjects close to his heart. As the wagons pulled into Sarah's yard, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. So much depended on the next few hours. If they failed to convince the magistrate that Luke needed protection, he would be returned to his father's custody, and Sarah had no doubt that Silas's retribution would be swift and brutal. But if they succeeded, it would establish a precedent that could protect other vulnerable individuals throughout the territory. Judge Winters approached the house with measured steps, his expression grave but determined. "Sarah, how's our boy holding up?" "He's scared but ready," she replied, stepping onto the porch to greet the assembled group. "We've practiced his testimony until he knows it by heart, but speaking in front of strangers will be different from practicing with just me and Reverend Bradley." Martha Henderson climbed down from her wagon with characteristic energy, her arms full of covered dishes. "Well, whatever happens today, that boy's going to know he's got people who care about him. I brought enough food to feed half the territory, figured folks might need sustenance for what's ahead." Doc Morrison joined them on the porch, medical bag in hand as always. "Any word on what witnesses Silas is planning to bring?" "According to my sources, he's got 3 character witnesses lined up," Judge Winters replied. "Men who'll testify to his standing in the community and his reputation as a responsible father. He's also planning to argue that Luke's condition makes him incompetent to make decisions about his own welfare, and that removing him from familiar surroundings would be harmful to his mental state." Sarah's jaw tightened with anger. Familiar surroundings where he was beaten and starved and locked in root cellars? That man's got some nerve. "It's a clever strategy," the judge admitted reluctantly. "He's betting that people's discomfort with Luke's disability will override their sympathy for his situation. We need to be prepared to counter that argument with clear evidence of abuse and equally clear evidence of Luke's capacity for independent thought and decision-making." Reverend Bradley stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "I've been giving this considerable thought and prayer, and I believe our strongest argument isn't legal but moral. We need to help people understand that protecting Luke isn't about his limitations. It's about our obligations as a Christian community to defend the vulnerable and innocent." As they prepared to leave for the schoolhouse, Luke emerged from the house wearing his best clothes, a clean shirt and trousers that Sarah had altered to fit him properly, along with boots that Doc Morrison had contributed when he noticed Luke's old ones were held together more by hope than leather. The transformation from the gaunt, fearful young man who'd appeared on Sarah's doorstep to this confident, well-cared-for person was striking, and Sarah hoped it would speak more eloquently than any words they might offer. "You ready for this, son?" Judge Winters asked gently. Luke nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his shirt collar. "I'm scared, but Mrs. Miles says being scared don't mean you can't be brave. And I got something worth being brave for now." The schoolhouse was already crowded when their group arrived, with folks from throughout the valley filling the benches that served as seating during church services. Sarah noticed several faces she didn't recognize. Word of the hearing had spread beyond Cedar Valley, drawing curious observers from neighboring communities. At the front of the room, a stern-faced man in a black suit sat behind the teacher's desk, reviewing a stack of papers with judicial gravity. Silas Garrett occupied a prominent position near the front, flanked by his 3 character witnesses. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean shirt and freshly trimmed beard that gave him an air of respectability. When his eyes met Sarah's across the room, she saw the cold calculation of a man who believed he held the winning hand. Magistrate Robert Sterling called the hearing to order with a sharp rap of his gavel against the desktop. We're here today to address the matter of Luke Garrett, specifically allegations that he has been subjected to abuse and neglect in his father's home, and a petition by Mrs. Sarah Miles to assume guardianship of said Luke Garrett. Mr. Silas Garrett, as the natural father, you have the right to present your case first. Silas rose with the confidence of a man accustomed to being believed. Your Honor, what we have here is a simple case of a lonely widow interfering with the proper raising of a disabled son. Luke's always been a challenge, his mind don't work like normal folks, and he requires firm guidance to keep him from hurting himself or others. I've done my best to care for him since his mother passed, teaching him responsibility and discipline as any good father would. He gestured toward Luke with what looked like paternal concern. Now, I'll grant you that my methods might seem harsh to someone who don't understand his condition. But Luke responds to structure and consequences. Without firm boundaries, he becomes confused and agitated. Mrs. Miles, meaning well I'm sure, has filled his head with ideas about independence and choices that just ain't realistic for someone in his situation. Silas's first character witness, a rancher named Tom Sullivan, testified to Silas's reputation as a hard-working, God-fearing man who'd faced considerable challenges raising a disabled son alone. The second witness, merchant Henry Walsh, spoke about Silas's consistent payment of debts and his regular attendance at church. The third, a neighboring farmer named Pete Morrison, described seeing Luke working competently around the Garrett homestead, apparently healthy and well supervised. Your Honor, Silas concluded, I'm asking you to return my son to his rightful home and to recognize that the proper place for someone with Luke's limitations is with family who understand his needs, not with strangers who might mean well but lack the experience to handle his condition safely. Magistrate Sterling made notes throughout Silas's presentation, his expression remaining carefully neutral. Mrs. Miles, you may now present your case. Sarah rose on unsteady legs, acutely aware that dozens of eyes were focused on her. She'd rehearsed this moment countless times, but the reality of standing before an official tribunal felt overwhelming. Then she caught sight of Luke's encouraging nod, and her resolve strengthened. Your Honor, what Mr. Garrett describes as firm guidance and necessary discipline, I call systematic abuse. Over the past weeks, we've documented evidence of beatings, starvation, imprisonment, and psychological torture that no human being should endure, regardless of their mental capacity. She nodded to Doc Morrison, who rose and presented his medical findings with clinical precision. The doctor's detailed documentation of Luke's injuries, combined with photographs he'd taken to preserve evidence, painted a damning picture of long-term physical abuse. Several people in the audience gasped audibly as he described the rope burns, malnutrition signs, and healed fractures that told the story of years of violence. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we contend that Luke is far more capable of independent thought and decision-making than his father claims. With proper support and encouragement, he's demonstrated the ability to care for himself, contribute meaningfully to household tasks, and make reasoned choices about his own welfare. Reverend Bradley took the stand next, his testimony focusing on the moral and spiritual aspects of the case. Your Honor, I've been ministering to frontier communities for over 20 years, and I've seen how isolation and hardship can corrupt a man's heart. But I've also seen the miraculous healing that occurs when love and patience replace fear and punishment. Luke Garrett has blossomed under Mrs. Miles's care in ways that prove his father's methods weren't just cruel, they were counterproductive. Martha Henderson followed with testimony about the community's growing awareness of Luke's situation and their collective failure to intervene sooner. "We all saw the signs," she admitted with characteristic bluntness. "The boy getting thinner each season, the way he flinched when his father spoke, the fear in his eyes whenever anyone mentioned his name. We told ourselves it wasn't our business, that Silas knew best how to handle his son's condition. We were wrong, and Luke paid the price for our cowardice." One by one, community members took the stand to describe incidents they'd witnessed or suspected over the years. Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile testified about Luke's obvious hunger during their occasional visits to town and the way he seemed to shrink into himself whenever Silas spoke harshly. Jim Crawford described finding Luke sleeping in his barn one winter night, too frightened to return home after accidentally breaking a tool. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Emily Anderson, a 12-year-old girl whose family lived near the Garrett homestead. Despite her youth, she spoke with startling clarity about what she'd observed from her bedroom window. "I seen Mr. Garrett hit Luke lots of times," she said in a clear, carrying voice. "And I heard him yelling real mean things, calling Luke stupid and worthless. Once I seen him drag Luke to the root cellar and lock him in there, and Luke was crying and begging to be let out. It made me have nightmares." Silas's face flushed red with anger as the child testified, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain his composed facade. The testimony of a young witness carried particular weight in frontier communities, where children were generally assumed to be truthful about what they'd seen. Finally, it was Luke's turn to speak. Sarah had debated whether to subject him to the stress of public testimony, but Luke himself had insisted on having his say. He approached the front of the room with careful dignity, his hands clasped tightly to control their trembling. "Your Honor," he began, his voice gaining strength as he continued, "my papa always told me I was too stupid to know what's good for me. Said I should be grateful for whatever I got, 'cause nobody else would want someone like me. But Mrs. Miles, she taught me different." He paused, gathering his thoughts with the careful deliberation that characterized all his speech. "She taught me that being different don't mean being worthless. That making mistakes is how everybody learns, not just cause for punishment. That love means wanting someone to be happy and safe, not scared all the time." Luke's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I know my mind don't work like other folks. I know I need help with some things, and I probably always will. But I also know the difference between right and wrong, between kindness and cruelty, between being cared for and being hurt. And I know I don't want to be hurt anymore." He looked directly at his father for the first time since the hearing began. "Papa, I ain't angry at you. Mrs. Miles says anger just makes more hurt. But I can't come home with you. I can't live scared anymore. I want to stay with Mrs. Miles, where I can learn and grow and maybe even help other folks who need help too." The silence that followed Luke's testimony was profound. Even Silas seemed momentarily stunned by his son's articulate expression of his own wishes and understanding of his situation. Magistrate Sterling called for a brief recess to consider the evidence presented. As people filed out of the schoolhouse for fresh air and quiet conversation, Sarah found herself surrounded by community members offering encouragement and support. The transformation was remarkable. People who had once viewed Luke as a burden or curiosity now spoke of him with respect and affection. "That boy's got more courage in his little finger than most grown men have in their whole body," declared Pete Morrison, ironically the same man who testified as a character witness for Silas. Hearing him speak his piece like that, well, it opened my eyes to things I should have seen years ago. When the hearing reconvened, Magistrate Sterling's expression was grave but resolved. "This case has presented me with one of the most difficult decisions of my judicial career. On one hand, We have the legal principle of paternal authority and the rights of a father to raise his child as he sees fit. On the other hand, we have compelling evidence of abuse and neglect that cannot be ignored in any civilized society. He paused, looking directly at Luke. Young man, your testimony today has demonstrated a level of understanding and self-awareness that contradicts any claim of mental incompetence. You clearly understand the nature of your situation and have expressed your wishes with remarkable clarity and courage. The magistrate's gaze shifted to Silas. Mr. Garrett, while I acknowledge the challenges of raising a disabled child alone, the evidence presented today shows a pattern of abuse that goes far beyond acceptable parental discipline. Your son's physical injuries, documented by qualified medical examination, speak to violence that has no justification under any circumstances. Sarah felt her heart pounding as the magistrate prepared to render his decision. Everything they'd worked for, everything Luke had suffered through, came down to this moment. Therefore, it is the decision of this court that Luke Garrett be removed from his father's custody and placed under the guardianship of Mrs. Sarah Miles, subject to periodic review to ensure his continued welfare and development. Furthermore, Mr. Silas Garrett is hereby enjoined from any contact with his son without prior approval from this court and proper supervision. The schoolhouse erupted in spontaneous applause, with many people rising to their feet in approval of the decision. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the reality of their victory sank in. Luke was safe. He was free. He was home. But even as she celebrated, Sarah noticed Silas Garrett's face, twisted with rage and humiliation as he absorbed the court's decision. She knew that men like Silas didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially not public defeat that stripped away their carefully constructed facades. She hoped that Silas would soon be able to accept what had happened and allow everyone in the community to live in peace. As the crowd began to disperse, Luke made his way to Sarah's side, his face glowing with an emotion she'd never seen there before, pure, uncomplicated joy. "Mrs. Miles," he said softly, "does this mean I can stay with you always? That I don't have to be scared anymore?" Sarah pulled him into a fierce embrace, not caring who might be watching or what they might think. "Yes, Luke. You can stay with me always. We're family now, you and me. Real family, the kind that's built on love instead of fear." As winter settled over Cedar Valley in the weeks that followed, Sarah watched Luke continue to bloom in his new life. He helped with household chores, tended the animals with growing expertise, and even began learning to read beyond the basic level his mother had taught him years before. More importantly, he'd begun to make friends among the younger men in the community, who discovered that his gentle nature and unwavering loyalty made him excellent company despite his intellectual differences. The victory in the hearing had cost Sarah something as well. Her comfortable anonymity in the community had been replaced by a reputation as someone who fought for justice regardless of the personal cost. Neighbors sought her advice on family disputes, and she found herself becoming an unofficial advocate for others who couldn't speak for themselves. Luke, meanwhile, had become something of a local hero. His courage in speaking truth to power had inspired others to examine their own willingness to stand up against injustice. Children who had once mocked his differences now sought his company, drawn by his patient kindness and genuine interest in their concerns. As Christmas approached, Sarah stood in her kitchen preparing for the first real celebration Luke had known since his mother's death. The house would be full of guests: Reverend Bradley, Martha Henderson, Doc Morrison, and several other families who had become part of their extended chosen family. Luke had worked for weeks on hand-carved gifts for everyone, his face glowing with the joy of having people to care for and celebrate with. "Mrs. Miles," Luke said, appearing in the doorway with his arms full of firewood, "do you think Mama would be proud of how I spoke up for myself? Do you think she'd be happy about us being a family?" Sarah set down her mixing bowl and smiled at this young man who had taught her so much about courage, resilience, and the transformative power of unconditional love. "Luke, I think your mama is watching over us both, and I think she's very proud indeed. Not just of how you spoke up, but of the man you're becoming every single day." Outside, snow began to fall softly across the valley, covering the landscape in pristine white that seemed to promise new beginnings and endless possibilities. Inside the warm kitchen, a woman and her chosen son prepared to celebrate not just Christmas, but the miracle of healing that occurred when love replaced fear, when community replaced isolation, and when justice finally triumphed over years of hidden cruelty. The story that had begun with deception and suffering had transformed into something beautiful, proof that even the most broken souls could find wholeness when surrounded by people who saw their worth and fought for their right to live with dignity and joy.